I really like horror too. So I started writing horror stories. The very first one I wrote sold, and then pretty much everything I ever wrote after that sold. So when I sold that first story, I didn't know anything about small press. So I, I know it existed at the time, but I was not involved or aware of it. I only knew about the magazines that I could find on in the magazine shop at the drugstore. So that was where I was expecting that most of my sales would be in the magazines. And I thought one day I would turn to novels, but at that time, really my focus was 100% on scary stories. So nowadays, I almost never write short stories. I only write books. So things, yeah, very different how I ended up compared to what I was doing at the time. And I guess I think at the time, I think I was imagining I would just be writing short stories the rest of my life.
Very cool. And obviously, you mentioned that you read ferociously, which I'm jealous that I'm such a slow reader. However, throughout the years, was there any really early influences that you read that you kind of attach yourself to and try to emulate, or that maybe even still have the biggest impact on you, either a specific author or specific type of story?
So my whole life, I've been absolutely fixated with time. I love time travel stories. I loved anything that mixed up time. So I read, I'm sure, hundreds of time travel kind of stories, so all science fiction, which is why I was mostly writing science fiction. But any TV show as well that kind of went into that area. So Twilight Zone and Outer Limits were my models. I got a lot of my focus from those two TV series. Some of the people who wrote for those stories, I read all of their books, like Jack Finney. We talked earlier about Richard Matheson, Rod Serling. They were probably my original role models, but probably the two that were most long-term impact on me one was John Wyndham. He was a British horror / science fiction writer, mostly in the 50s and 60s. He wrote a number of great books, Trouble with Lightkin, The Midwit Cuckoos, Trouble with Triffids, and a bunch of others. I love the combination of horror and science fiction, and that has followed me through my whole career, and it's clearly because of him. But the other person who I think almost everybody recognizes that I wouldn't say deliberately emulate him, but there's an awful lot of similarity between my writing and Stephen King writing. I learned a lot about writing from him when I was starting to publish my short stories. I read every short story he ever wrote and found out where he published them, and that helped me find markets. And I loved his style from 1974 to about 1982. After that, I no longer write like he does, but in the first 8 years or 7 years of his publishing career, I've written my whole life like he did back then.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely get that too, because I know with reading a lot of your characters, they're very relatable. And I mean, King's a very big pantser as well. He never really he doesn't really worry too much about plot. I think your stories that I've read so far are a lot more plot driven, but I don't think that the plot's necessary to enjoy the story. It just happens that there is also a point to the story too, in these characters that you kind of follow along with.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any point of writing a story or a novel if the reader isn't going to care about the characters. That's, to me, the only thing that matters. The plot is secondary, although I often think of the plot first, but I won't write it until I know who the characters are and what kind of real big problems I can give them.
Speaking of which, too, it's kind of interesting that you mentioned that you don't really write short stories anymore. Maybe that's because you got them completely out of your system, having read upwards of 200 or more short stories. And then what I found was super fascinating is that you didn't write your first actual novel until you were 51. And I always wanted to ask you, basically, what took you so long? Like, why wait that long before trying your hand at an actual novel, and why sort of push short stories aside to focus on the longer stuff?
Yeah, there's some there's two novels that I tried to write early on, and they're the memoir talks about those. One was actually both of them were about 1983, 1984. So not long after I started publishing, I wrote two novels. The first one was science fiction, and it was really, really bad. The second one was a vampire novel, and it was a ripoff of Stephen King's Salem Plot. So those two didn't work out so good for me. And although the first one almost got published, and if it had, that would have been a big change in my life, because then I probably would have tried to continue writing science fiction and not been very happy the rest of my life. But fortunately, it didn't sell. But those two novels I wrote, and I think at that point, I just felt I'm not a novelist. I'm a short story writer. I'm very successful at writing short stories and articles, writing book reviews, interviews, articles for business magazines, like all of that stuff I could nail perfectly. And it takes a long time to write a novel. And I just thought it doesn't feel like it's worth my investment, because I'm just not a good enough writer. And I just didn't think of it until in 2000, in the late 1990s, when I finally started writing the memory tree again.
Very awesome. And you've got a Bram Stoker award over there, of course, that says that you're good enough. So, and I guess to kind of go into maybe a bit of the deeper waters a little bit too, John, is super brave and super open and honest with you that you wrote the article that you did, that you're very open about that, and as well as some other early childhood traumas that you don't shy away from talking about in your memoir. But what I find fascinating is that despite those really intense anecdotes that you talk about, and you talk about some other stuff that's not so serious, like you mentioned, why put the word quirky in your title? Why is it do you consider it such a quirky little memoir when it has some pretty somber topics that are anything but quirky?
Yeah, probably the least quirky thing is what happened with the memory tree. I was sexually abused as a child for a long time, and that is what the memory tree is about, my first novel. And so that was obviously not a trivial topic. And you're right, there's lots of others in the book. As I was writing the book, 3 of my good friends, writers, died. And it's like, what's going on here? It's like every time I turned around, one of my friends was dying. But as I was writing it, that was not the first title. The first title was actually 23andMe, because at the time I started writing it, I had 23 other books published. And I thought it'd be funny to use the name of the DNA testing thing, the 23andMe. So that was the working title for a while. But then as I was writing it, I realized there was going to be a lot of really heavy topics in here. And I didn't want to make it a depressing book, and I didn't want to make it a boring book. So I thought the only way to fix it up is to make it funny. So there's lots of jokes in here. The way I specifically used a way of writing that's very light. And obviously when those darker topics came up, I gave it the appropriate tone, but I also didn't want to dwell on those. I wanted to, that was one small part of 25 books and 40 years of writing. So I wanted it to be fun to read. And that was my number one goal, is make it fun to read. And I thought, I don't know of any other memoir that's fun to read. They're all boring. And I thought, why is everybody going to think mine is any different? And I thought, well, I have to do something with the title. And quirky to me means unusual and fun, on the fun side of things. So I thought that gives, I think, a pretty accurate description of what I was trying to do. Whether I succeeded or not, we'll see.
Yeah. Well, I know for me that's read it, it's 100% succeeded. It's very, very quirky, very cool. It's very much like a memory, going down memory lane as well, especially, for myself, I know a lot of the same people that you did. So it was very cool hearing about those people again. Mm-hmm. So you absolutely nailed that part. And I think the fact that it is so quirky, it made some of the more intense parts of your being just very much like a gut punch where I felt very taken back, and I also wanted to give you a call and say, "Do you want to meet up? Can I give you a hug?" So it definitely encapsulated a lot, both of those aspects. And certainly speaking of, some of that, the early childhood trauma that you did go through with the sexual abuse, and then recently, of course, tragedy of losing your daughter. Maybe particularly with the early childhood stuff, how did you find that? I mean, that anybody can't be helped but be impacted by that, be reshaped by that. How would you say that informed or impacted your life moving forward, and maybe specifically how it might have informed the type of stories that you would write, or the way that you would write those stories?
Well, certainly the one where that came out the most was in the memory tree, and it was a very when I got to the point in the book where it first said this is what's happening, and it was very blunt, and it was very disturbing. I couldn't write it. I just froze, and no matter how many times I went back to the computer, I couldn't get past it. And for 5 years, I kept trying to write that chapter, and I couldn't do it. I just put it aside, and I finally said, I got to write this thing, and because sexual abuse does not go away. It stays with you your whole life. And no matter what else, you're always going to know you're a victim of sexual abuse, and you can't shake it. So I knew I'd have to get over this thing that was blocking me. And so I finally one day just said, I'm doing it today. I thought of something else, and I just let my fingers type. And my fingers came up with what I needed on the paper. And then from there, I finished the last half of the book in like a month. So it was easy to get through once I got past that. What I found there is that, and what I carried from there into other future books, is that I'm very dark horror writer, what I want to be. And a lot of my characters suffered greatly. And some of them, they deserve it. So I didn't feel bad. But some of them didn't deserve it. They were just like little kids who got run over and bad things happened to them. And but that had to happen for the story. When actually this book came out, little by little, Lisa Morton, is a very good friend of mine, wrote the introduction to that book. And at one point she said something, I haven't read it for 10 years, but something to the effect that John writes a lot about some specific items. He writes a lot about time. He writes a lot about love. He writes a lot about cruelty. And I thought, really? Cruelty? And then I was thinking, yeah, that's right. and I think the cruelty to my characters is almost certainly due to that sexual abuse when I was young. Not that I'm specifically saying anything about it, it's just that I'm willing to abuse my characters probably a lot more than most horror writers do. I also have very light books as well. So in my personal life, though, it's also affected me. I mean, you mentioned you never shake sexual abuse. To this day, I know there are behaviors I have that are clearly associated with that. I mean, the main one is that I almost exclusively will not make male friends because I don't trust men because of what happened to me. There's a few people in this room that are exceptions to that. Certainly Chris is one of those. But that's very much the exception to the rule. I mostly go out of my way to avoid making friends with men. I can be friends with women, no problem, but not men. And I know that's purely because of what happened when I was a kid. It doesn't make it any easier to overcome it. And there's other things that that I still carry with me that from time to time rear their heads, and oh yeah, I know why that's there.
And I can only imagine too the roller coaster that you must have went on. I mean, it's one thing to go back as you're editing a book and kind of reflected on the story that you just told, but it's another thing entirely that you go back on 25 books that you did, and then think about all the short stories you did before that too. I can only imagine what kind of a roller coaster that must have been for you as you're putting yourself in that spot, very vulnerable spot, for having to reflect back on your entire, or really your entire life through writing. What did you find that was informative to you as well? That maybe it gave you pause to reflect on a few things that might have been a surprise for you, that you thought, wow, okay, yeah, that's where I was when I wrote this story, or wow, that's exactly why I wrote this book, and maybe you hadn't thought about it long enough that you either forgot about it, or maybe you just didn't realize it, so you had to think about it again for the memoir.
Absolutely. When I started writing, there was no such thing as email. I mean, that's how long ago this was. But I have all kinds of letters, and letters from editors, and copies of letters that I wrote, letters from other authors. Whenever I read a book that I enjoyed, I read a letter to the author, and once in a while they would write back. So I have letters from Michael Crichton and Stephen King and Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, and all of these letters that now they're kind of pieces of history in a way, that these incredible authors took their time to write to me. But I also found all these things that I wrote, and as I was reading them, I was thinking, I remember this. Like, I remember that very first short story I wrote when I was 12 years old. And it's like, I'm back in that little kid's head. And he's so excited typing this story, and the joy he was feeling just writing the story. And then reading the story now, and I think, this is actually pretty good. I was very surprised that, like, I never had any interest in writing until that day. And then it just fell out of my fingers, and it was a pretty decent story for a 12-year-old. And the others, when I read, and I read letters from editors and publishers asking me to write books for them. And it was like, before The Memory Tree was published, I think there was close to 100 publishers and agents that I tried to sell the book to. None of them would read the book, except for one. I'll come back to that. Basically, nobody wanted to give me the time of day. And after The Memory Tree was published, everybody knew me. And that was a big surprise. Any author in the horror field knew me. All the editors knew me. The publishers all knew me, within the small press, not the giant companies. And they all wanted me to write for them. And it was like, that was a literal switch that happened when that book was published, that changed everything that had gone on before. And the only thing that I said I'd come back to, The Memory Tree was almost published by Penguin Books, which would have been really cool. And again, this is before email. I got a letter from Penguin saying, we're pretty sure we want to publish The Memory Tree. I'm an editor of whatever, and I'm bringing this to our editor Thursday meeting, and I'm going to pitch it there. I'm pretty sure that everybody will agree. Well, they didn't agree. They couldn't publish the material. They thought it was too graphic. But I was almost there. And Penguin is one of the biggest publishers in the world, so who knows what might have happened differently if they had published that first book. But they didn't, and ended up dealing with a small press, which I've been very, very happy with. I've been very fortunate in my career.
Yeah, and the interesting about that is, what I'm wondering about is, if Penguin picked you up, I mean, obviously that's not every writer's dream, but a lot of writers' dream to get picked up by one of the big 5 publishers. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting to me is that if they picked you up, do you think that the small press publishers that were inviting you to write for them might have thought that was too lofty for a goal, and they wouldn't even bother trying to approach you?
So they didn't approach me until after it was published in the small press. So before that is when the Penguin thing happened. But if they had, if Penguin had published the book, I don't think the small press would have come to me. I think they don't go to Stephen King or any of the other people who have large publishers. So I think it would have been a totally different career path.
And to kind of go back a little bit on what you were talking about before about sort of your style, that you're very much into time. You love playing around with time. You love playing around with the ideas of people meddling with time. And I mean, we've seen it through countless movies and media how badly that can always turn out. At the same time, what I find is really fascinating is I think that we're all bound by time. We often don't know how much time we have. So I find it's really interesting reading your stories with very relatable characters that, at least for me, I find myself thinking, okay, well, if this happened to me, how would I respond to that? And how would I react to this? And how would that kind of transform my life? And maybe that's one of the big reasons why you are so popular and why your books are so easily digestible and memorable, is that you give us as readers a lot to really reflect on and to put ourselves in those places, and kind of almost changes our perspective in a lot of the ways on how we see the world around us, at least for me, and how I kind of fit into this world that you've created. I can only imagine does the same thing for you. Is there any stories, maybe any particular stories you can think of that you went into it thinking, I'm going to play around with this idea because this is what I have in mind now, and then after you finish the book thinking, wow, I had no idea that's what I really think about this scenario or this bedling, if you will, use a Scooby-Doo phrase.
So I usually, if I'm going to write a story about time, I usually figure out the problems that I want to solve first. So like Miranda, for example, was about a person living their life backwards. So the first thing they experienced was when they undied and they traveled, getting younger and younger in time, going through the life while everybody else was moving forward in time. And so I thought that is a really cool puzzle. And what would his life story be like? And really Miranda was his life story, going from the day he died back to the day he was born. And it was incredibly difficult story to write because everything that happened, every single sentence, had to make sense for him moving backward in time, but everybody else who's moving forward in time saw what he's doing, and it had to make sense for them as well. And it was a real bastard to write that thing, because no matter how many times I wrote it and I thought I had it, I'd read it one more time and I'd find, no, this bit here, it doesn't work because it doesn't work in reverse order. And so that was my most challenging book, and the one that I probably am most proud of in some ways, because it did what I wanted, except for at the very end, there's a big giant hole in the book. And I thought, there's no way to fix this. And I thought, well, then I'm just going to put it on public display as big as I can and hope that people just are so surprised by what happens, they don't realize it's impossible. And I left it in there and I crossed my fingers. And so when Miranda was published, it was very popular. It did win both the Black Quill Award and the Bram Stoker Award. Everybody was talking about this book. Nobody noticed this giant plot hole at the back of the book, except for finally one guy, a friend of mine, wrote me and said, my mother just read Miranda, and she says there's a problem here, and I don't think there is, but I can't figure out how to explain to her why it's right the way it is. So can you tell me what to tell her to appease her that everything is right the way it's written? And I had to admit to him that his mother was way smarter than he was. And explained that, yeah, I knew that hole was there, and your mother's the only one who's ever caught it.
Just tell her, oops.
But now that you're going to put this on your podcast, everybody's going to go get out their books. What was talking about? What's hole?
Perfect. They'll all reread it again and give it all their friends so they can figure it out too. So
Yeah.
who's the smartest one? So, yeah, that's a good idea, actually. Thank you. Yes. So this next question here, I don't want to offend the mutual friends in the back here at all, but this is kind of a day job question. So I understand that obviously you didn't really find your roots as far as being a novelist until you were 51.
Yeah.
But considering the success that you've had in that, what I think is a pretty relatively short amount of time. I mean, you won a Bram Stoker Award in a very short amount of time. Did it ever occur to you to kind of, no offense, to say goodbye day job? I'm going to start kind of planning out my exit strategy on being a full-time writer and just going all in, or did that? What stopped you from doing that?
I actually tried that once. in 1983 or 84, when I was writing those two novels that didn't work out, I took 2 months off of work, a leave of absence, July and August. And I thought, I'm going to finish these two novels in these 2 months. I'm going to write a whole bunch of short stories. And I'm going to see what it would be like to be a full-time novelist. And so I did that. And after 2 months, I had written nothing and had watched a lot of Wheel of Fortune. So whatever drives me to write when I only have a little tiny bit of time evaporates when I have a lot of time. So it's not in the cards for me to do. And also given that I write in a small press, even if I was somehow able to write a book every 3 months or something, there's not enough money in the small press to do it. So I need my friends at the back to keep me employed.
You're never a contestant on the Wheel of Fortune.
No.
So
I was almost a contestant on Jeopardy. I got invited to go and try out, and I got to meet Alex Trebek.
Well, that's cool.
And me and a bunch of other people, I don't know, 10 or 12 other people were in a room, and we all played a game. And I guess I didn't do good enough. So
sorry, not sorry that you didn't get on there and win the big ones. So speaking of which, so do you have a writing schedule then that you adhere to, seeing that you force yourself to only have so much time to do all the writing?
So these days, in the past month, I've not done any writing. But when I was working on the memoir and what will happen when I write the next book, typically Saturdays and Sundays, because me and my wife are old and we go to bed early during the week. So, so Saturdays and Sundays are the best days for writing. So if I can write for an hour each day, I plan very well for those hours. And so during the whole rest of the week, I'm thinking about what I'm going to write on the weekend. And then I write really, really fast. I'm a very fast typist. And so on a weekend, I can write like 20 or 30 pages. So that's a tenth of a novel in one weekend. So it doesn't take me a lot of time, except for the preparation time. It's all week. And then the actual hands-on keyboard time isn't very long.
Okay, that's impressive. Another question I had I was very fascinated by reading this book as well, is that maybe one of the more fascinating aspects of it is you describe yourself when it comes to religion as agnostic. And again, I definitely relate to that too. I would consider myself certainly agnostic / spiritual. I'm very open-minded. I definitely believe that if you get new information that changes how you reflect on that sort of thing, it's important to stop and reflect on it to see if maybe you're wrong all along or you change your thoughts on it. And what I found really fascinating is that I've never heard of an agnostic person who went out to rewrite 3 religious novels themselves. And I saw one right over there, and they're not skinny. It's not a Coles Notes version.
This one's Exodus. So yeah, I wrote Genesis, Exodus, and Ruth. And what these books are is, I don't know how many of you who's ever tried to read the Bible? About half of you? When I read the Bible when I was a teenager, I read the King James Version, which was really a very bad choice because it's impossible to read, I think. In the 70s, I read the Living Bible. And then more recently, I've been reading other versions. So I'm quite familiar with the Bible itself. And Fatima asked me at one point to write the Bible so that she could understand it. And I thought, well, there's a challenge. So Genesis takes about 30 pages in a typical Bible. My version of Genesis took 650 pages because it takes that long to explain what is it saying. So I converted. I went through every verse of Genesis, looked at like 10 or 15 different translations, and then tried to figure out as best I could what is the simplest way to express what this verse says. And then I said, okay, that's what it says. This is what it means. And you can't, even if you read what it says, there's so many things that we don't know about life 3,000 years ago. We don't know all of the names of the people that were referenced. We don't know the names of places. We don't know the customs. So I researched all of that and put it all in the book to be nice and clear. So to me, writing these books is not about professing that I'm a believer in Christianity or anything like that. What I'm saying is the Bible is an amazing book. It is full of fascinating stories, history, love stories. It's a book about what life was like back then. To me is one of the most incredibly interesting books that nobody can ever understand. So I'm trying to make it easier for people to understand, to appreciate what the Bible really is. And if they use that because they're a religious person, great. If they read it because they just happen to understand that the Bible is one of our greatest pieces of literature ever, that's great too. And I'm very proud of my Bible books, even though I would say today I don't believe in God. I do believe in Jesus Christ, which is kind of an odd dichotomy, but there's certainly enough historical evidence that there was a preacher named Jesus, and that he did travel and he did say all of these things that he's professed to say, and that he was crucified. I don't think there's any question all of that happened. What there's question about is, did he do the miracles, and is he the Son of God? But either way, I think Christianity, in the amount of time they actually teach what Jesus said, I think that's a very useful use for a preacher, because he's said some amazing things, and I think we should all live by what Jesus said. So yes, I'm a confirmed believer in God, but on the other hand, I'm not sure, because I'm also extremely knowledgeable about science. I know an awful lot about general relativity and quantum mechanics and cosmology. And when I think about the beginning of the universe, science can't answer what happened before the Big Bang.
Right.
Why did the Big Bang happen? There's no scientist who has an answer for that. It happened 13.8 billion years ago, but why and how? Nobody knows. So maybe God did it. I don't know. I have no reason to think one way or the other at the moment, but I'm very interested in the topic, very interested in religious matters. At some point, I would like to write a book about comparative religions between Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and talk about the good things and the things that they have in common and what they believe, because everybody gets most of that wrong. Even Christians don't know what Christianity is all about. But that's a book for like 30 or 40 down the road, probably.
Great. So, and it's fascinating too with these three books. I can only imagine what kind of, I don't want to call it backlash, but maybe feedback from folks that thought, how dare you try to rewrite their religion? And I'm sure you probably got that in equal parts of people saying, finally, a religious book that I can not only enjoy reading, but actually understand. Did you get a lot of mixed reviews or a lot of mixed feedback on that?
Only had positive reviews, not a single negative review, not a single negative comment from anybody anywhere. So that tells me I succeeded to some extent, because I didn't want to take away from what they believe. I wanted to add to it, and by maybe explaining some things they didn't understand.
Perfect.
And it's like an example of how nobody can read Genesis and understand it. An example is that twice in the book, Jacob says to Joseph, "Put your hand on my thigh and promise me blah, blah, blah," whatever. And the first time I saw that, I thought, well, that's a weird custom. Why put your hand on his thigh? But I didn't think anything of it until the second time it came up, and then I thought, hold on, this is not normal. And it took me a long time to figure out that was a custom back then, not to put a hand on a thigh, but to say that, because what he was really doing was he was telling Joseph, hold my testicles with your right hand. And the reason for that is when you're making a promise, if you're holding somebody by the testicles with your right hand, you can't get your knife out and slash him. And meanwhile, the guy who's being held can't do anything because you got his testicles in your hand. So he's not going to do anything. So that is a way of mutually disarming each person while they make this commitment. And that is what it means when in the Bible it says, put your hand on my thigh and promise me this. It took a long time to find that, but I eventually found it.
Not going to ask you how, but I'm glad that came up. That's great. So, and of course, though, we've got the expression "got you by the balls," and that's where it came from.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Yeah, I don't think I'd ever draw a knife on somebody that had me by the parts. Yeah. Okay. Might need a moment before I ask you the next question. So I guess sort of diving into a little bit of mysticism here. If you were to have a genie and you popped out and said, it's a crappy genie, only gives you one wish. But if you got that one wish, and you're allowed to give yourself a bonus wish if it's too tough of a question to ask. Looking back on your entire writing career and it's tough to have a long writing career that would have a lot of failures as well as a lot of successes. So maybe you wouldn't change most of your quote unquote failures or learning experiences as a writer, but if you could change anything, would you? Or is there any one thing that you could change where you thought, oh man, if only I did this instead of that, this would have been pivotal?
So I'll answer your question first and then say why, and I would not change anything. And the reason is that I believe everything in my life has led up to who I am today and led to me meeting Fatima. And the last 13 years of my life have been gloriously happy because of her and the girls. And I would never do anything to change that, behavior. Like if Penguin had picked up the memory tree, my life would have been quite different. And maybe I would have stayed living in wherever I was living at the time, Vancouver. And I wouldn't have needed to be working in Kitchener where I met Fatima. So, I think everything has led me to where I am today. And I am incredibly happy today. I'm even happy working with the crowd at the back. They're all wonderful people. And so, no, I wouldn't change a thing. And from a writing career, I've had a really successful writing career. I'm very, very fortunate to have found all these opportunities and all these people want to publish my stuff. And I've got a lot of fans out there who love my work. And, we haven't been to a convention for a while, but the last time we went to a convention was StokerCon in 2019. And when we were there, you see people who you only see every few years, and they come up and say, "It's so good to see you. Can you sign all these books?" And I had one guy come up with 15 of my novels or books to ask me to sign them all. And it's like, wow, where have you been? And how do I make more of you? but it's really an awesome feeling to have this recognition and to be able to write what I want. That's an important part too. Nobody's ever told me what to write, so that's nice.
Well, thank goodness, because maybe you wouldn't have come up with the stories if somebody just said, write this.
Yeah,
so that's
fantastic. Might not have worked out as good.
Now, with that in mind too, and not wanting to change anything, so obviously you feel that all along the way you constantly had the proper trajectory for your writing life and how your personal life came out to be. Is there any, based on all that kind of stuff, maybe more when you think about some of the learning opportunities that you had along the way, is there any specific advice you would maybe give to either new writers or people that have been around for a while that are maybe struggling, or like, I don't know if this writing thing is for me, or I want to be better at my writing, what do I need to do? What's maybe some of the best advice that maybe even other people have given to you over the years that was pivotal to you, that made a huge impact on you?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that make my writing stand out. One is that I do my very best to make things clear. I write and rewrite until it can't be any clearer. And I use a vocabulary that's grade 4, which sounds really like an odd thing to do, but in fact, grade 4 can read really well. All of my books are grade 4. And that sounds really odd to say, but it's true. But if there's one piece of advice I would give to a beginning writer, I know they would never ever listen to me, and that advice is never self-publish, because you don't learn anything from it. There is no editor, and the way you learn how to write is by having editors tell you what you've done wrong. And the only way you do that is by sending stories or books into magazines or to book publishers. But most younger writers don't want to hear that because it's easy to self-publish. Nobody's going to stop you. But also nobody's going to read what you wrote. So 5 of my books were self-published, but not until I had a long string of successful regular publication. And then I could get away with it. Cool.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice too, because I know certainly lucky enough to have a book coming out a bit about how to write book reviews. And I was going to self-publish it. And then I decided, well, no, I'm going to start up here and work my way down. And that was the best decision I ever made as well, because I'm thinking to myself, doing this for over 20 years, like, I know how to write book reviews and telling people how to do the same thing, but it doesn't mean I know how to put an actual book together.
Yeah.
So when I had all the edits, I thought, I really don't know anything. So it was fantastic. That's great advice.
Yeah.
And when you look back as well on all the books that you do have, so you've got 25 and sounds like in counting, so I'll get to that in a second as well. If there's one book that if somebody came up to you and said, I want to read you seem like a really nice guy. I've heard you write really good. I read at a grade 4 level, so this is perfect. But where do I start? Is there any books that you would point them at specifically and think, this is the one that's going to hook you, and if you don't like this book, then you just don't like me, and maybe you read at the grade 6 level?
I think my favorite of my own books is Placeholders. That was another one like Miranda, where time's very twisted. It was a very difficult book to write. There was a guy who keeps jumping through time and into other people's bodies just before he dies. So he would jump into a body like of a guy falling out of an airplane with a parachute that doesn't work. So he'd only be in this person's body for 3 seconds or something, and then he'd die, and then he'd be transported into some other person's body who is about to die. He doesn't know why he's doing all of this, and it seems like sometimes it's out of sequence, out of time. And when I started writing it, I thought, I have no idea what's happening here. But I kept making him die in more gruesome ways. And as I went through, I realized what it was that was making this happen. And it turned into a mystery story, weaved through this time travel horror story. And I really like the mystery part of it, of trying to think, all the readers are going to wonder, why is this happening? And to be able to give a satisfactory solution to that was very satisfying. And I think that's my best book. It'd be hard to beat that one.
That is an awesome answer, because that's actually the first one that I read of yours, and now I'm here. So, so perfect. No, that's a great one. And we kind of talked about this a little bit before. Is certainly when it, books such as Placeholder, I like to think I'm pretty smart when it comes to trying to figure out the big reveal at the end before it actually happens. And I thought that I figured that out a few times with some of your stories, and I kind of did, but that doesn't mean that I was actually prepared for the way that it was going to end and the execution of it all, and thinking, I think this guy did this, and I might be right, but I had no idea what the implication of it was at the end of the stories.
Yeah.
Do you usually, when you start a story, I know you mentioned that you do some outlining, so you've got a pretty good idea of what problem you need to solve.
Yeah.
But do you often know when you start a story how you're going to solve that problem and what you're going towards?
I usually have a pretty good idea. I did not with Placeholders, but that was the exception. So when I write a book, I say I'm going to have 40 chapters, and I get a spreadsheet out, and I write 1 through 40, and I write one sentence about each chapter. Because then it's one sentence is not very much, so it leaves me a huge amount of flexibility when I'm writing the chapter. But as long as that one thing happens, then I know I can find my way to the end. And along the way, I usually invent all kinds of things, and some of them become more important than what I started with. But I still have the bare bones that if I need to, I can go back to the where my head was at when I first started, get to the end. The most important part is being able to get to the end, because otherwise you're just wandering around and it'll never end.
And that's clearly what separates you from Stephen King. So, just kind of a couple more questions to sort of wrap everything up here too, John, is you talked about, I'm so excited because I feel like I just discovered a lot of your work. I've read through some of your stories. And then reading this, it's a really sad thing to think from a reader perspective that you're that close to throwing the towel on all of your writing. So it's really exciting that as a reader that, and somebody personal too, I think it's an amazing that, knowing what your writing means to you personally, that the memoir was really, sorry, I'm looking at it, but this is actually underneath here. There you go. So the memoir, that it really was a path back to getting rejuvenated for yourself as a writer, and that personal part of you that is so prominent in your life. Regarding the rejuvenation, what is it that you see in store for yourself? I know you mentioned that some of the books are maybe 30 books down the road, so I'm not sure if that's tongue in cheek or if you in fact have 30 books planned out, or if you've got one maybe that's half written already at home that you're waiting to get back to. What do you see as your next few writing projects to really get back in the saddle?
Yeah, so the next one will be my last short story collection, which will be called Lost Little Tales. It is the collection of stories that probably nobody has ever seen. They were published in little magazines, or some of them were never published at all, even though they deserve to be. So it'll be a collection of stuff nobody's ever seen before, but it's older stuff. So that's the last of 4 books of short stories that I've been publishing. I've been very fortunate that one of the publishers on the West Coast wanted to publish the collected short fiction of John R. Little in 4 volumes. And it's very cool because the 4, if you put them in a square, they make a giant piece of art. They all have color artwork by one of the best artists in the field. And they take good care to make this a really quality project. So this is the last of the 4 books. And I haven't got it all, the manuscript ready, because I have to get old magazines and retype them all, because none of them exist on any electronic form. So that's my next project. That'll probably take the rest of this year. After that, I have 2 more Bible books I want to write, which is The Life of Jesus and The Death of Jesus. Which are the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels. The 4 Gospels have a lot of overlapping information. So I've gone through and matched everything up in all 4 Gospels, so that if, where Jesus fed a bunch of people here, I found that in the other 3 books and lined them all up. So I know this is the same event. And then figured out all of the different events in the Gospels, and then figured out what's actually the right chronological order. Then figured out what's the best translation for each of them, and then my commentary. So the first book is written, The Life of Jesus. I have to do The Death of Jesus now. So hopefully those 2 will be done next year, 2025. Then I have a novel that's half written called Forget Me Not, which is, I think, going to be a really exciting book for my fans. It's a novel, 2 different types of issues with memory. So the first one is about a guy who remembers things that hasn't happened yet. And then the second one is a pandemic that causes people to slowly lose all their memories. And these 2 pieces of structure kind of intersect, and it's very interesting how it all comes together. So I've got that novel to write. I've got a YA novel that I'm about halfway done that will be down the line at some point. I'm going to take a break from the Bible stuff for a while, but eventually I want to do Proverbs and Acts. They're probably one day, if I'm still alive, they'll be the next 2 Bible books. And I have other ideas for novels. I want to write a novel about the nature of reality, which I've been thinking about for a long time and haven't written anything yet, but that'll be out there at some point too. That's as far as I can predict.
That's not too bad. We'll live with that for now. So, that's fantastic. And it's kind of funny too, because I find that whenever I talk to any authors, I almost feel like I don't want to take away from the writing part of it itself, but a lot of times it seems that you kind of, maybe more from a reader perspective too, that their favorite authors have really made it when there's movies out of their books where people want to make a movie. And I know that it's pretty common. I know you mentioned a lot of that in your memoir as well, that you've had plenty of options, and I've heard of some authors that make a nice side hustle, just simply selling the option rights to their stories without ever actually having anything made. As long as they get paid, they don't, I'm sure they care, but they enjoy it. But you've actually lucked out, and I know you've had a lot of your stuff optioned for movies that haven't really turned into movies. But what can you tell me about the one in particular called Ursa Major that you've got a pretty good feeling about it, and that it's, I think you mentioned they're in pre-production, or I'll let you tell us all about that.
So it's a movie in two separate components. The producer approached me 12, 13 years ago, I don't know, something like that, and said she wanted to make a movie out of Ursa Major, and by then I'd heard that a lot, and so I thought, yeah, okay, why, and who are you? I researched and realized, oh, she's actually a big producer. So she read the book on an airplane traveling from England to LA, and she said she loved the way that the book was written. The book was inspired by Emma over there. When me and Fatima first got together, and Emma was a lot smaller then, and I thought about what would happen with a man who wanted to bond with his stepdaughter by taking her to a cabin and showing her the stars and just getting to know each other. And unfortunately, they got trapped inside their cabin with a grizzly bear. And most of the action in the book takes place inside the cabin with the father and the daughter stuck in a closet kind of thing. And it's a very suspenseful novel, but the producer really liked the relationship between the characters. That's what really got her. And she said she wanted to make this the Jaws of the grizzly world, which I thought was pretty cool. And she talked about some of the stars she wanted to be in it, and I was like, had to pick me up off the floor after she named who they were. It didn't work out, and the reason it didn't work out is because she either would have had to use a real life grizzly bear and kill the main character in real world, or use special effects, but special effects weren't good enough. So they let the option die for 10 years. And last year, she got a hold of me and said, special effects are way better now. Now we can do it. So they re-optioned it, and they still have the screenplay from the first time around. I love the screenplay. It's very faithful to the book, except they changed the names of the main characters, and I have no idea why, but that's okay. The check's still cleared. So I am hopeful that by the end of next year, there will be a movie either on the big screen or on TV for Ursa Major. Really looking forward to it.
All right, well, thank you very much, John, and thanks to everybody else as well. You guys have been amazing too. Thank you. So I guess that kind of wraps up all the brain picking that I had for John. So hopefully I left enough that there's some great amount left over for you guys to kind of ask away as well.
Any questions? Marianne, you must have a question.